Deputy Prime Minister, we'll come to domestic party politics in a moment, but let's start, I guess, with the big issue of the weekend. We are contributing to Ukraine's defence, but is NATO about to betray Ukraine by starving it of military aid?
No, and it's essential that 2 years on from the commencement of this conflict, the illegal invasion of a sovereign democratic European state, that we hold the course. It's worth actually thinking about the progress that we've made. A year ago, 2 years ago, we thought those tanks would go trundling across Ukraine and its freedom would be snuffed out. Actually, not only have the Ukrainians bravely resisted, the UK, working with the US and others, have led the way in a united front. Ukraine has regained over half of its territory. We've announced further military aid just recently, over £2.5 billion, bringing to a total £12 billion from the UK. We've trained over 60,000 Ukrainians, but now is the moment where we have to hold our nerve and support the Ukrainians, because if we don't stand up to aggression here and now, we will pay a much greater price further down the line.
That's very clear. The American Congress, which is holding up $60 billion worth of military aid, doesn't seem to have heard that message.
Well, of course, that's for the American people and the American Congress. We continue to urge Congress to pass the measures necessary to get that additional aid to the people of Ukraine, for the simple reason that I set out, namely that if we show a wavering here in relation to Russian aggression in Ukraine, we will surely pay a greater price against other countries further down the line. And I hope that the Congress appreciates that and will eventually provide that authorization.
Yesterday, Boris Johnson was in Kyiv alongside the leaders of Italy and the EU. Why wasn't Rishi Sunak there?
Rishi Sunak contributed to the G7 conference, virtually as did many other G7 leaders. We've been totally resolute in our support for Ukraine. Rishi Sunak was out there a few weeks ago announcing a further increase in UK aid for Ukraine, up to £2.5 billion. The Defence Secretary made clear just yesterday that there'd be a further £245 million to support the Ukrainians with ammunition. There has been zero wavering of our support, and I pay tribute to Boris Johnson. It runs through Boris Johnson, who initiated our action on this, and Rishi Sunak has carried it forward.
Indeed, but the optics aren't great, are they? Boris Johnson is not Prime Minister anymore. We have at least two, a current Prime Minister and a former Prime Minister who might have been available to be there. You shouldn't read from that any diminution whatsoever in United Kingdom support for Ukraine. We are foursquare behind them, as you saw with the presence of Rishi Sunak in Kiev just a few weeks ago. All right. Look, the reality here is that the Ukrainians are losing ground. They're running out of ammunition. There is the possibility, heightened after last night, of a Trump presidency, which would mean a diminution or possibly an end to military aid to Ukraine from America. Should we, as a good friend to the Ukrainians, actually be sitting down privately with him and with Mr. Zelensky and saying, honestly, now is the moment to negotiate, because you're never going to be stronger than you are now?
Well, I would just challenge a few of the things that you said there, Trevor. First of all, I wouldn't read in. I don't want to sort of start commenting too much on the state of the battlefield in Ukraine, but it's not the case that there's been some great Russian surge. Broadly, it's a sort of stalemate position over the past few months. There has been one small gain recently from the Russians. More broadly, though, the position of the UK has been and will remain that we cannot allow Russian aggression to triumph. And what I would say in respect of the US is, first of all, don't read too much into where the US is going. Many people have been made fools of by speculating on US presidential elections. Also, we don't know the direction in which individual candidates are going to end up going. Our role now is to remain foursquare behind the people of Ukraine, to give President Zelensky the maximum power and leverage as leader of Ukraine to defend his people. And there should be no wavering on that, and there won't be any wavering from the British government.
All right, which one last quick one on this issue? NATO is looking for a new boss, Mr. Stoltenberg standing down. Is it true, as is reported, that we are supporting the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte for the job?
Well, I think Mark Rutte would make an excellent candidate. I'm not sure we have formally declared our position, and we will go through the usual processes that we go through in terms of these arrangements to make the decision for the next leader of NATO.
So Ben Wallace, who I think was mooted as a candidate, isn't in the frame anymore?
Well, I think Ben has already made clear that that's not the case, yeah.
All right, let's talk about your party. The former deputy chairman, Lee Anderson, has been suspended for saying that the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is in control of his Islamist mates, I think is the expression you used. The mayor replied that these remarks were Islamophobic and racist. Does Mr. Anderson's suspension mean that the Conservative Party regards Mr. Anderson as a racist?
The reason why the party took the decision to suspend the whip from Lee Anderson was that what he said was wrong and words matter. And he was given the opportunity to apologise, and he didn't do so. So therefore, we removed the whip. What I would say is more broadly, we also need to take very, very seriously what has been going on in the past week or so in Parliament. It cannot be. These two are related, which is that we should not be distracted from the underlying issue here that has been going on this week. So we cannot allow the kind of violence that we've seen and the threats and intimidation, whether it's against Jewish people on the streets of this country, whether it's in those marches, and now apparently it coming to affect the what's going on in Parliament. And the two are related in the sense that we should not allow one to distract from the other.
We've got time, and I do want to talk about that, but let's just deal with Mr. Anderson for the moment. The question I asked you is does the Conservative Party's suspension of Mr. Anderson mean that at least he is suspected of being a racist?
Well, what the words that he chose to use were not the right words to use. They were the wrong words, and words do matter. And he was given that opportunity to apologise, and he didn't. So I do not accept the words that he used. He shouldn't have used those words, and that's why, having failed to apologise, we have withdrawn the whip. But as I say, Trevor, it's essential that we look at the underlying issues as well. And I think it's entirely right that as a party and as a government, we face up to what has been happening recently.
I want to do that, but I just want to get past this specific issue. And I'm noticing I'm not hearing the word no in answer to my question. But let me ask you just a very specific question. Is he still your candidate in Ashfield while he's suspended?
Well, in terms of the pure process, when the whip is suspended, that relates to someone's conduct in Parliament. When it comes to a reselection process, that would be something that would happen much further down the line.
All right, let's talk about some remarks from other members of the party. Suella Braverman says that we're sleepwalking into a ghettoised society where Sharia law, the Islamist mob, and anti-Semites take over communities. Now, you've booted Lee Anderson out for his remarks. Why is Suella Braverman still in the party? Why does she still have the whip?
Well, and this goes to what I was trying to say a little earlier, Trevor, in respect of what Lee Anderson said, and it pertains to what Suella said, which is that I don't shy away for a moment from facing up to what is happening right now. And I think all of us need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what have we allowed our society to become? Where I see from my own constituents, where Jewish people are fearful of walking the streets showing symbols of their own religion, where we have hate on marches, and now we have the situation where the actual conduct of Parliament is apparently being influenced by threats of violence and intimidation. And I think all of us have a responsibility to face up to what's happening here. It is un-British, and we must take this as a wake-up call not to allow this to happen. And I support anyone who calls this out. And indeed, you've seen the words from the Prime Minister expressing our grave concern about this.
The Prime Minister does not mention Mr. Anderson in his article today. So let me ask you directly. When you talk about the way in which the sentiment is being expressed, are we talking about Lee Anderson attack on Sadiq Khan? Are we talking about Suella Braverman talking about the Islamist mob? Are we talking about Liz Truss saying we need a bigger bazooka? Is this the kind of language that Conservatives now plan to employ?
Well, Trevor, I have said several times, I'm happy to say again, that I don't agree with the language that was used by Lee Anderson. But nonetheless, it is the case that I feel strongly that we have allowed ourselves to get to get to a situation where violence, threats of violence and intimidation are seeking to influence debate in this country. This is not acceptable. It's not British. It's a cause of worry to me. It's a cause of worry to my constituents and many people up and down this country. And I think all of us owe a responsibility. But forgive me, just all of us owe a responsibility to call this out, whether it's people who are participating on the marches. When people participate on those marches, they need to ask themselves who they are marching alongside. Now, when it comes to the wording used by individual Conservatives, I've said that I disagreed with the language used by Lee Anderson. It was right for him to apologise, and his failure to apologise meant that we had the whip withdrawn. I don't believe that the language used by Suella Braverman has crossed the line whereby she should apologise for it. No, I don't.
One clear signal about of where the Conservative Party might be going is what you decide to do if Mr. Nigel Farage applies for membership of the Conservative Party. If he were to apply, would you welcome him back?
Well, I, like many hundreds of thousands of Conservatives up and down the country, have spent many years campaigning against parties led by Nigel Farage. So, no, I don't support Nigel Farage rejoining the Conservative Party.
The point I'm really trying to get at here, Deputy Prime Minister, is that right now we don't quite know what Tory party we're being asked to vote for. Is it the old school, genteel, One Nation Conservative Party that I think most people associate with Oliver Dowden? Or is it this modern, brash, take no prisoners conservatism of Lee Anderson, Liz Truss and Suella Braverman? Who are you?
Well, I think what I've been trying to get across to you, Trevor, in my answers, and maybe I haven't been doing it very well, is to say that I don't think that it's incompatible being a one-nation Conservative, as I am, Boris Johnson, many others have been.
Boris Johnson
was certainly a one-nation Conservative in the past, but calling out these kind of threats and intimidation, actually, as a one-nation Conservative who believes in our nation and defending the values of this nation, one of the most precious values of our country is free speech, free expression, and our parliamentary democracy. And we have seen in the past week threats to that parliamentary democracy, and in a situation that I think you would have scarce believed a few years ago, where the conduct of the House of Commons could be influenced by threats of violence. And I do not think that it's not One Nation Conservative or Conservative to call that out, and I support the calling out of it.
The person who's supposed to guarantee or lead on the conduct of the House of Commons is the Speaker. After this week, should he stand down?
Well, I think the Speaker has serious questions to answer about what happened, and that's what the Leader of the House will be asking about on Monday. I like the Speaker personally. I backed him for the leadership. I think he made a serious error of judgment in allowing outside threats to influence what happened in the House of Commons. However meaningfully he did it, it was a major misjudgment, and I think he needs to account for himself for that.
He talked about the intimidation and threats to members. Do you know of a member who has been threatened? Have you been threatened? And where has that threat come from?
Well, I think it's sadly the case that many members of Parliament have been threatened, and indeed that has been the case in relation to me as well. And I think this goes to a wider point about the way in which...
What was the nature of the threat to you?
It is the case that, and it was the case we all of us unfortunately face threats of violence, death threats and so on, of varying degrees. I've never had one that has been of the most serious nature, but we routinely receive these kind of threats. But I think there are two things. One is about the civility of discourse in this country. That is to say that I've always agreed with robust debate and argument. But when that, particularly through social media, extends to threats of violence, that is totally unacceptable. And there is also some extremist Islamist threats that we have seen, which I see against my own constituents. We see in some of these marches, which has taken it up a further degree again. And this is something that is very, very worrying for me. And now it's important that we take individual steps to protect members of parliament, and we have a process for doing it. But it can't be by laws alone. We also need to call out this kind of culture of threats and intimidation influencing debate in this country.
OK. May I just ask you one last question? We're carrying a story this morning about the early release scheme launched last October. It's meant to take pressure off our overcrowded prisons. It appears that this scheme is now going to be extended indefinitely. Can you confirm that? And do you think that if it is extended, the system can actually cope?
Well, we want to minimise the use of this scheme. It is worth bearing in mind, Joe, that what's happened with our prisons. Essentially, through COVID, we developed enormous backlogs in our prisons, mainly because people were not getting through the courts in sufficient numbers. So there's unprecedented demand in our prisons. We've had, in response to that, we've built unprecedented numbers of prison places, the biggest prison building programme since the Victorian era. To manage that gap occasionally between supply and demand, we need to have these temporary measures, but the Prime Minister and the Lord Chancellor are committed to minimising their use, and I think that's the appropriate course.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you so much for your time this morning.